If you were to put Joe Biden's policies on Israel next to Donald Trump's policies on Israel, I'd be curious if you'd notice much, if any, of a difference. Both presidents and both parties have announced their unwavering support for Israel. And specifically since October 7th, I think that this is putting Democrats in particular at a crossroads, an injuncture, a moral intersection of whether or not they support openly Joe Biden and the administration's policies on Israel-Palestine. Now, some people will say, well, you don't have to support the government on everything if you're a Democrat and Biden's in office, of course. But one thing that I think most are underestimating is the Israel-Palestine war is changing the collective consciousness on that conflict subtly and in large strides. So I've said this in a previous video. I don't think it's going to be palatable anymore for politicians to openly state that they have this unwavering support for Israel. I don't know that to be true. And the reason why is because what we're seeing right now in Gaza, I believe there's over 40,000 civilians that have been killed, if we believe the numbers that are coming out of Gaza. But I've said in earlier videos that politicians are always looking for that window of what was once not acceptable and now is entering that acceptable view of the policy to discuss. I think that politicians are going to have a really hard time this year and in future years on the election campaign if they openly discuss their unwavering support for Israel everywhere they go. I think that that's going to be met with a lot of resistance, and it's not just from young people. More and more polls are showing that people are very divided when it comes to the war in Palestine. And what's also interesting to this is since October 7th, Joe Biden has only reinstated his support for Israel during this conflict. In fact, on October 20th, Joe Biden put forward a bill for $14.1 billion to support Israel's military efforts. And that is a lot of money. And I think that's going to alienate him from many progressives within his own party. But also, I think that's going to alienate him from undecided voters, perhaps more younger voters in particular, but also from potentially some moderates. The question is, who do you choose, Biden or Trump? Because both have very strong policies when it comes to Israel and their support of Israel. But perhaps they'll push this vote to a third candidate or one that's more critical of Israel. And so the actions of Biden since October 7th when it comes to the Israel-Palestine war, I would argue would be no different had a Republican been in the White House. And so, again, I think this does pose a conflict. And the reason why, again, as we know, liberals are more humanitarian. They're concerned with the general public and civilians. And civilian casualties are really high in Gaza. I think also people have underestimated, myself included, the pro-Palestine encampments at universities across Canada and the United States. I 100% underestimated those. I did not think they would take root as much as they have. But their slogans have been disclose, divest, and denounce the genocide in Gaza. There are universities who are not only disclosing, but are committing to divesting their funds from companies that work with Israel or supply material for Israel, specifically in the West Bank encampments, etc. So let's not for a minute think that the pro-Palestine encampments haven't had an impact on our public policy. They very well have, and potentially can continue to have as the days and weeks move on. But in an election year, you'd think that Joe Biden would potentially say something along the lines of, we've provided this funding to Israel for its military defense. We are deeply committed to ensuring that there are as little to no civilian casualty deaths. And so we are going to use our diplomatic efforts and means to pressure the Israeli government. Should there be more civilian deaths, that 14.1 billion comes back on the table, and we may very well withdraw those funds. I mean, again, a veiled threat, an empty threat potentially, yes, but at least it would acknowledge what many progressives and those on the left, when it comes to Palestine and the pro-Palestine movement, at least an acknowledgement to decipher and differentiate the Democrats from the Republicans come election time. But like I said before, you put Joe Biden's policies next to Donald Trump's on this conflict, and I don't think you would see any of a difference. You know, the last thing I'll say about this as well is there is something to be said of ceasefires. The United States, I could be wrong, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe they've ever voted in favor of a ceasefire. I believe they've vetoed various UN security resolutions calling for ceasefires, citing that this would give Hamas the upper hand and it would legitimize Hamas as well. And so that's also quite peculiar and fascinating that the United States has done so. And it's very much aligned with previous policies in support of Israel. Now, let me just, for the record, say that my opinion on this Israel-Palestine conflict is one that needs to respect the nuance of the conflict, condemn Hamas. I wish the pro-Palestine protesters would condemn Hamas more and openly say we're not here to protest in favor of Hamas, who has led a very brutal regime on civil rights and civil liberties. I wish more protesters would provide that nuance in their protests, as well as some tangible ideas not only universities can consider, but also governments writ large, specifically in the West, that are less inflammatory, that are respectful of Jewish students, recognizing the experience of Jewish students on campus. I wish the students would also discuss the real experience of Jewish students and the real threat within the movements that are anti-Semitic and can lead to violence, harassment, discrimination towards Jewish students. You know, if those elements within these movements were cleaned up, quote unquote, I think they may have even greater efficacy for moderates who are less one-sided on this issue, and that would have perhaps even a greater impact. So interesting to see that Joe Biden's policies on Israel are identical to the Republicans. There hasn't been widespread condemnation for the killing of civilians. Again, I could be wrong. Someone please let me know. And finally, I do think that there is something to be said about the United States vetoing ceasefire calls and others. And I think this is leaving progressives at a crossroads. I don't know if they're not going to choose Biden in the face of Donald Trump come November, but on this issue, there is no difference at all as I see it. And it'll be interesting to see if more progressives pressure Joe Biden in the months leading up to the into the election, to change his stance on this issue and provide a more humanitarian approach. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you also not see a difference between Democrats and Republicans on this issue? Let me know what you think in the comment section below.